A courier burst into the foreign ministry in Tokyo on the morning of February 3, 1943, carrying a telegram from Berlin. The room smelled of tobacco and ink. Men looked up from maps and schedules. The dispatch from Ambassador Hiroshi Oshima was short, blunt, and impossible to ignore. German forces had been encircled at Stalingrad. What the message delivered in facts, it delivered even more forcefully in meaning. A fracture in the image of an unassailable Axis Europe. In Tokyo, a calculation that had seemed distant and theoretical suddenly arrived by cable. Publicly, Prime Minister Hideki Tojo answered the shock with the language of solidarity. At a press conference, he reassured the nation that Axis unity remained intact and victory was still possible. The government's broadcasts emphasized collective resolve. Newspapers printed statements of confidence. But behind closed doors, in cramped ministry offices, around the low tables of the Supreme War Council, in the private notebooks of naval officers, the mood was different. Men who had spoken of strategy in abstract now faced the tangible loss of a critical pillar of Japan's global posture. What had been a hopeful assumption that German arms would keep the European powers occupied, that the Soviet Union and Britain on the defensive, that the alliance would constrain the Allies to separate fronts, began to look like a fragile bet placed on vanishing resources. If you want the full timeline and sources, subscribe and check the episode notes. To understand why a telegram from Berlin mattered so much in Tokyo, it helps to see what Japanese strategists had assumed at the war's outset. The tripartite pact bound Germany, Italy, and Japan in a formal alliance, but more importantly, it structured hope. Japanese planners counted on Germany to immobilize Western Europe and to keep the Soviet Union and Britain on the defensive so Tokyo could pursue its own regional ambitions with limited interference. That was not merely arrogance, it was a strategic dependency. Japanese planners worried about overstretch, the combination of limited industrial capacity, a fragile merchant fleet, and the geography of the Pacific, and they relied on an allied Europe that could keep crucial enemies engaged. Stalingrad was not simply a battlefield defeat. It signaled the beginning of an attrition that Germany could not easily repair: men, material, fuel. In Tokyo, that reality recalibrated how confident policymakers could be about the long war they had imagined. One telling pattern emerges when we look at how reports came from Berlin and how they were read in Tokyo. Ambassador Oshima, enthusiastic and personally impressed by German technological prowess, served as both conduit and filter. He sent dispatches that mixed admiration with alarm. At times, he sought to reassure Tokyo by emphasizing German resilience. At other times, his language admitted the severity of the losses. Japanese leaders read these cables as both reassurance and warning. The more Germany tried to project endurance, the more its strain became visible. From 1943 through 1944, a sequence of events in Europe steadily eroded the strategic confidence Japan had placed in its partner. After Stalingrad came the collapse of Axis control in North Africa. The campaign in Tunisia and the Allied lifting of the Mediterranean Seaway threatened the Axis supply lines to Italy and North Africa, and it diminished the sense that Germany could dictate terms in Europe. The invasion of Sicily and the subsequent overthrow of Mussolini exposed another vulnerability. Germany had to divert resources to shore up its defenses in Italy, again drawing strength away from any presumed buffer in the East. Each headline from Europe tightened a knot of anxiety in Tokyo. Japan's leaders reacted to this erosion in a way that revealed deep institutional and cultural divisions. Three broad camps emerged in the decision-making apparatus. One was formed largely by naval officers, diplomats, and a minority of high officials oriented toward pragmatic negotiation. The Navy, having suffered at the hands of American submarines and realized that Japan's merchant fleet could not sustain unbounded operations, increasingly favored diplomatic openings and contingency planning. The second camp, moderate spread across political and civilian posts, urged continued resistance while exploring back channels for peace, aiming to preserve the nation and its polity if possible. The third, most intransigent faction was concentrated in the army and in elements of the officer class, for whom honor and a refusal to accept defeat were overriding principles. For them, retreat was a moral failure rather than a strategic choice. This internal map mattered because Germany's setbacks affected each faction differently. Naval leaders, watching convoys sink and fuel stocks dwindle, read Berlin's losses as proof that global isolation was tightening. If Germany could no longer tie down Allied strength in Europe or deter Soviet intervention, Japan's strategic position would worsen. Army leaders, committed to a struggle of attrition and to holding territory, responded with increased rigidity. The loss of Germany might be a blow, but it could not be accepted as a reason to concede. Japan's political reality was that the choice between seeking terms and preparing for desperate defense was not purely rational calculation. It was heavily shaped by institutional cultures and by concerns about face, honor, and the consequences of perceived capitulation. As the war in Europe marched on into 1944, Tokyo watched each major German setback as a hinge moment. The Allied landings in Normandy on June 6, 1944, were not simply an operational catastrophe for Germany, they represented a geopolitical collapse of the barrier German warfare had once formed. For Japanese policymakers trying to imagine a post-war balance, Normandy suggested that Europe would soon be firmly under Allied control and that any hope of Germany diverting Allied attention would evaporate. At the same time, the fall of Rome and the Italian armistice had already shown that German influence in previously aligned countries was waning. German manpower was drying up. Fuel shortages constrained movement. The Luftwaffe's diminishing capacity could no longer contest the skies as before. For Tokyo, these were not isolated failures but cumulative evidence that the strategic environment was closing. One of the more consequential consequences of German decline was psychological. An alliance is more than treaties and shared objectives. It is also a shared narrative about inevitability. Until early 1943, many in Japan could imagine a longer war where an eventual negotiated settlement might leave Japan intact, maybe with losses but retaining sovereignty. As Germany's prospects dimmed, that narrative fractured. Ambassadors and emissaries who had confidently predicted a settlement that favored the Axis now transmitted a sense of narrowing possibilities. Oshima's dispatches, once assertive, began to sound more strained and, in certain passages, alarmed. Yonai Mitsumasa, a naval man whose private diary recorded a cautious realism, began writing about the necessity of contingency planning in terms that suggested a diminishing margin for maneuver. The material consequences of Germany's attrition reinforced the psychological squeeze. Tokyo faced a crippling logistic reality. American submarines were systematically choking Japanese shipping, sinking tankers and transports that delivered oil, grain, and raw materials. By late 1943 and into 1944, Japan's merchant fleet had been reduced to a fraction of its pre-war tonnage. Fuel shortages became acute, forcing rationing and grounding ships, aircraft, and factories. These shortages were not created by Germany's collapse alone. They were the result of sustained Allied pressure in the Pacific. But Germany's decline meant that Tokyo could no longer count on a European partner to open diversionary fronts, nor could it hope for meaningful transfers of material assistance from Europe. In short, Japan's logistic predicament converged with a diplomatic isolation. Inside the Supreme War Council and at the Navy Ministry, debate turned from abstractions to grim arithmetic. Admirals and ministers drew up tables estimating how many months of fuel reserves remained, how many convoys could be expected to survive, and what territory could be defended with an increasingly barren fleet. The Navy's growing realism put it at odds with Army officers who believed Japan's destiny lay in continued resistance to the last. The paradox was bitter. The Army had fought successful campaigns on the Asian mainland and saw holding ground as the path to negotiation. The Navy, seeing transport and fuel decline, feared that holding ground without naval capacity was a tactic for catastrophe. By mid-1944, the fall of Saipan crystallized this dilemma into immediate political consequences. Saipan's loss in June-July 1944 put the Japanese home islands within range of American B-29 heavy bombers. Once long-range strategic bombing became a viable threat, Tokyo's sense of security shifted dramatically. Political fallout followed. Prime Minister Tojo was forced from office in July, partly because the loss signaled operational failure and partly because it exposed a need for new approaches. Successive cabinets wrestled with whether to continue a high-cost defense or to explore avenues to end the fighting. Yet, the fracture between the Army's insistence on fighting and the Navy's plea for diplomacy had hardened, not only over strategy, but over what surrender or negotiation might mean for the imperial institution and for the social order. Meanwhile, Tokyo continued to observe Europe with a mixture of hope and resignation. Each Allied success in 1944, the crushing of German forces in France, the liberation of Paris, and the steady Soviet push from the East sent a clear signal. Germany was being reduced to fighting for survival on its home soil. For Japanese strategists, this had two related effects. First, it removed the latent threat that Germany would hold territory or force that could have divided Allied resources in a way favorable to Japan. Second, it signaled the possibility of Soviet realignment. If Germany fell, the Soviet Union, long a signatory of a neutrality pact with Japan, would no longer be bound by the same strategic constraints or opportunities that existed when Germany remained a counterbalance in Europe. The question of the Soviet Union's role was especially fraught. Japanese diplomacy had, for long stretches of the war, relied on the Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact, signed in April 1941. Many in Tokyo reasoned that, as long as the Soviets remained neutral, Japan could hope to negotiate a mediated settlement with American or British initiative. The fall of Germany, however, removed the incentive for the Soviet Union to remain passive. Soviet leaders watched how the balance in Europe shifted, and they prepared for a chance to assert influence in East Asia. In Tokyo, this possibility loomed as one more reason why Germany's decline mattered. Without Germany tying down the Soviets, Japan risked confrontation on yet another front, or, at minimum, losing diplomatic leverage that could have been used to negotiate more favorable terms. By the start of 1945, the cumulative effect of these pressures had narrowed Japan's strategic options into a painful set. Fight on a diminishing set of lines and hope for a change in Allied political will. Seek negotiations but be forced to accept terms that might threaten the imperial institution. Or attempt to inflict enough damage on Allied forces to constrain settlement terms at a future date. Each option carried moral and material costs, and each was bound up with how the leadership interpreted Germany's collapse. For those inclined to negotiate, the point was simple. Europe was lost. The window to fashion a mediated settlement that preserved more of Japan's autonomy had closed or was closing. For diehards, Germany's fall was an argument not for surrender, but for refusing to accept a world in which both Axis partners were defeated. Oshima's cables from Berlin, read repeatedly in Tokyo's ministries, illustrate how interpretation mattered. He remained, in some respects, a committed believer in German military ingenuity. At the same time, he acknowledged the strain and the worsening supply situation. His reporting created a complex impression. Germany had not capitulated, but it had been weakened to the point where expectations of meaningful assistance were unrealistic. Ministers and service chiefs in Tokyo debated what that shift in odds meant for Japan's negotiation position. If Germany could no longer deter Allied insistence on unconditional surrender or could not occupy enough territory to bargain with, then Japan might find itself negotiating from a position of increasing weakness. That political weakening manifested in tangible diplomatic consequences. As Germany's ports and railways were bombed and as the Wehrmacht reeled, opportunities for clandestine material support or pressure on the Western Allies diminished. Transports that might have conveyed parts, fuel, or advisors from Europe were fewer, and the ideological solidarity that had once animated Axis propaganda seemed hollow in the face of continuous Allied advances. Japanese diplomats, once able to point to a continental partner as a balancing force, began to find themselves making appeals that were less persuasive on the world stage. In a sense, Germany's decline shrank the realm of symbolic and concrete resources Japan could bring to the bargaining table. The summer of 1945 brought the crisis to a head. The B-29 air campaign had devastated urban centers. Firebombing had leveled Tokyo and other cities, killing tens of thousands and destroying industrial capacity. Japan's economy, already strained by shortages and blockade, creaked under the weight of hunger and transport collapse. Then came two shocks in quick succession that historians have debated at length: the atomic bombing of Hiroshima on August 6 and of Nagasaki on August 9. And, between those dates and immediately after, the Soviet Union's long-expected but politically decisive declaration of war against Japan on August 8, and its invasion of Manchuria and the Kuril Islands. It is important to place these events in the larger chain rather than treating them as freestanding determiners. The atomic bombs presented an unprecedented destructive capacity and produced an immediate visceral horror. The Soviet declaration, however, had its own strategic implications that were amplified precisely because Germany's collapse had already deprived Japan of alternative strategic partners. A Soviet offensive exposed the possibility of Soviet occupation of Japanese-held territories and threatened the political autonomy of any post-war government. For many officials in Tokyo, the combination of devastation at home, the prospect of Soviet invasion, and the lack of external allies forced a brutal recognition. Japan's options had narrowed to an extent that prolonged resistance would mean national annihilation in material and social terms. In the crucial meetings of the Supreme War Council in mid-August 1945, this narrowing of options played out with painful clarity. The council was split, as it had been for years, but the scale of destruction and the new geopolitical calculus prompted an unprecedented step. Emperor Hirohito intervened directly in the deliberations. He urged acceptance of the Potsdam terms, which in practice meant surrender with conditions to preserve the imperial institution, if possible. That intervention broke the deadlock. A small group of officers attempted to resist by force in a short-lived coup, but the conspirators failed. War Minister Anami Korichika, torn between loyalty to the fight and duty to the emperor, chose suicide. His death epitomized the mixture of personal honor and institutional rupture that marked Japan's endgame. The surrender broadcast on August 15, famously avoiding the word surrender, was a somber culmination of this process. It was not a neat moral victory for the Allies, nor a tidy capitulation by a cornered state. It was the outcome of a long sequence in which military setbacks in Europe and the Pacific, logistic collapse, nuclear destruction, and Soviet action converged to remove the strategic options Japan had hoped to preserve. Notably, Germany's decline was not the only cause. It was, however, a decisive structural factor in that it systematically eroded Japan's diplomatic leverage and undermined the narrative of shared Axis resistance that had sustained hope. Without Germany holding European fronts and without the possibility of a divided Allied focus, Japan faced a world in which negotiation would be more difficult and costly. After the surrender, testimonies and interrogations offered different perspectives on how much Germany's fall mattered. Admiral Yonai, later interviewed, emphasized the pragmatic calculations that naval professionals had made years earlier. He framed Germany's weakening as one of multiple variables that made Japan's strategic position untenable. Ambassador Oshima faced scrutiny for his optimistic tone in earlier dispatches and for the ambiguities in his later messages. In post-war interrogations, he defended his interpretations while acknowledging the grim picture he had come to believe. These personal accounts matter because they illuminate how leaders read and misread reality. The fall of Germany was read through a lens of institutional priorities, personal loyalties, and hope, and that variance in perception shaped policy, often with tragic consequences. The human cost of delayed recalibration cannot be overstated. Cities burned, millions suffered displacement, and countless lives were lost in the months after Axis collapse in Europe had become evident. Had Japan's leadership moved earlier toward negotiation and open questions shaped by political and cultural constraints, the fighting in the final months might have been reduced. Yet such counterfactuals must be handled carefully. The Army's commitment to continued struggle, the fear of losing the imperial institution, the extremist ideology that permeated parts of the officer corps, and the complexity of Allied demands all made earlier settlement difficult. Germany's collapse did not mechanically force Japan to fight on. It altered the conditions that made negotiations more fraught and concessions more likely to be harsh. What this history reveals, then, is subtle but clear. Germany's decline did not single-handedly cause Japan's surrender, nor was it the only determinant. Rather, it functioned as a structural accelerator that narrowed Japan's diplomatic options, weakened the symbiotic backbone of the Axis alliance, and intensified the material shortages that made sustained military resistance increasingly costly. The loss of a powerful European partner meant that Japan could neither expect meaningful strategic relief nor rely on an external actor to constrain Allied demands. It also transformed the psychology of decision-making. Hopes for a mediated or negotiated settlement diminished as the prospect of isolated resistance and Soviet opportunism increased. In practical terms, this meant that by the summer of 1945, Japanese leaders faced a truncated set of possibilities. Prolonged resistance risked total devastation. Negotiation would carry the loss of territories and a diminution of sovereignty. And attempts to exploit an imagined window of Allied fatigue were less plausible because Germany's collapse had allowed the Allies to concentrate resources in Asia. Those are not the conditions under which diplomatic leverage thrives. Instead, they are the conditions in which decisions are made under duress, where the calculus of survival and the preservation of certain institutions, above all the imperial house, dominate. The final image is a bitter human one. Ministers and generals in a dim council room, a tape recorder or a diary noting the quiet voice of an emperor whose intervention ended years of cabinet dispute. An officer clutching a sword and choosing suicide rather than live with a perceived dishonor. Cities emptied and labor conscripted to the war effort while food grew scarcer. That image is not an indictment of any single person so much as a portrait of a system whose choices were constrained by events beyond its control and by internal forces that limited flexibility. Answering the question posed by the title, "What is the truth behind Japan's reaction to Germany's decline in the war?" demands that we embrace complexity. The truth is not reducible to a single telegram, a single battle, or a single personality. It is a tapestry of military setbacks, diplomatic isolation, institutional culture, and human psychology. Germany's collapse was a decisive structural factor. It removed hopes of a balancing partner, it signaled a changing balance of global power, and it intensified material shortages that made prolonged resistance exponentially more costly. It was part of the architecture that narrowed Japanese choices and accelerated the timing and character of Japan's surrender. Finally, the story is a moral as well as historical lesson. Alliances shape more than strategy. They shape expectation and identity. When a partner fails, the vacuum left behind is not only military but political and psychological. For Japan in 1943 to 1945, the erosion of the Axis pillar in Europe meant that military calculations had to be confronted with a reality that allowed less time, less room for negotiation, and fewer humane options. The cost of that contraction fell most heavily on civilians and rank-and-file soldiers who carried the consequences of choices made by a leadership split between competing logics of honor, survival, and pride. For deeper reading and primary sources, check the description and share this video if you found this perspective useful.